It is Friday, and it is time for audience questions. We have some really, really great questions today to answer. Evan wrote in, said, do you think the U.S. should implement mandatory voting laws, and what do you think needs to be done to ensure they don't backfire? Okay, this is a really good question because we've talked about the problem of low voter turnout many times, and as progressives, we're also aware of the fact that the average of all political beliefs is more liberal than the average of the political beliefs of voters. In other words, by having a larger percentage of people voting, you are statistically going to have more progressive results. So this is a very, very important question. The best argument I can think of in terms of mandatory voting, Lewis, would be, listen, in the same way that taxation is something that is part of living and working in the United States, voting could be a civic duty as well. And that means if you don't want to pay taxes in the US, you do have choices, right? You can move somewhere else. You can choose not to work. You can lobby for laws to be changed so that you don't need to pay taxes. You can become a tax criminal. You can just refuse to pay taxes. And of course, there would be punishments for that if you're caught, but you do have options. If you don't want to vote, then you do have a lot of those same choices. If voting were mandatory, you could say, well, this is part of what is done here. Jury duty is one of these things. Taxation is one of these things. So I think that there would be a very fair legal case to say citizens vote and you're expected to vote. And if you don't, I'm not saying we threaten people with going to jail, but maybe there's a fine for not voting, or maybe there's some other way that this is done. Many countries have mandatory voting. All of those countries would still consider themselves to be very, very free. Of course, there are countries that have mandatory voting and not mandatory voting that for other reasons would not consider themselves to be free. That's a different issue. And it would be a good thing if our Congress, if our representatives more closely reflected the desires and positions of more of the people in the country. So, Lewis, I think that there's a very strong case to make for mandatory voting.
I don't think it should come to that. I don't think that we need to make it mandatory. I think what we should do is make it easier for everybody. I think voting is way too difficult in many cases because of voter ID and all of that nonsense. But also, depending on where you live and your work hours and other things, it may just be very hard to vote. So let's come up with some type of online system that anyone can do from their home computer, from their smartphone, and let's just streamline it and make it easy. And I think that would, I don't think we would need to make it mandatory ever if we could just do that.
Well, the arguments against making it mandatory per se, the main one is it's undemocratic, right? If you are not voting is part of a free society, having the choice of, oh, I can choose to vote or not, and it's still a free society, and that by taking away that freedom, you're actually reducing democracy. By making people have to cast a ballot, you are reducing democracy. Of course, most countries that have mandatory voting allow you to cast a blank ballot, and in that case, you have a very different meaning attached to a non-vote, right? So just not showing up out of indifference is different than going and saying, I'm here to do my civic duty of voting, and I am choosing to vote a blank ballot. So that's different. And then another argument is more of a fiscal argument, which is in any system that has mandatory voting, there are reasons that you can get an exemption not to have to vote. And the verification of whether people who didn't vote did or didn't have valid reasons would become a very cost-intensive thing. But to me, Lewis, that seems more like a logistical argument, not really one that should dictate, broadly speaking, do we want to have a more participatory democracy or not? So do I think that we need to make voting mandatory in order to truly increase voter turnout? No, I actually agree with Lewis and say there are many things that could be done to increase voter turnout that wouldn't require making voting mandatory per se. But I would seriously consider arguments from people who say we should actually look at making voting mandatory.
I will listen to the arguments. I will entertain the idea, I guess. But, as it stands, I don't like the idea of it. And instead, I think we should just make things easy for people and stop putting up walls.